everyone to the final installment of Keller's MFA Creative Writing Program's Writing Now series. Hello to everyone watching us online. Shout out Matthias. We wish you a quick recovery. Want to acknowledge the work of Rosa for an incredible job setting up the logistics for this entire series, this whole year. We are in debt to her for our experience. And I would just love it if we could just big Moham, thank you. Thank you, Moham. It is my great honor to introduce Roberto Tejada, but to do that is an impossible task. And the only appropriate introduction for Roberto would be an endless introduction. But we are here specifically to celebrate the release of this book, Why the Assembly Disbanded, that just came out. Please look into it. Also want to shout out this atomic bomb of a book, slow release atomic bomb, still nowhere in an empty vastness. It's freaking incredible. And the design was actually done by none other than Doug Kieran. So shout out Cal Arts. But to thank also the Provost's office, Patricia Gonzalez, for her support with this event. We want to also thank Brian Evanson, our chair. Thank you. And as a way of introduction, I'll just read a part of a poem that was dedicated to Roberto Tejada in this book by Anne Lauterbach called Spell. So, bear with me. Number 4, irregular parable of the unconsidered. The sanctioned she, her adamancy, and rich rewards for her club of fans. The acolytes of Glamour, the followers of the mask. These are notes from an earlier procedure that involved paying for 1%. Difficult to believe we are living now. Difficult to believe it all hasn't been snatched back into gas and dust arcing across the universe soundlessly. Does sound disappear? Roberto asked. That's a mixed metaphor, he said, and I had to think, sipping my coffee. Seeing is not believing. Hearing is not appearing. Let's please welcome Roberto Tejada.
Thank you all. Thank you, Kenny, for those lovely words by Anne Lauterbach, whose work I admire and with whom I've had a conversation precisely about hearing and seeing and the differences between. Rosa, Bon, thank you, and Brian, thank you for your generosity. It's really a pleasure for me to be here, and a particular honor, as I hope what I'll present will demonstrate. I'm going to be reading from a book that has been really 10 years in the making for various reasons. That in one sense bring together works that engage or want to interrogate borders in the broadest sense, both actual and surreal, and on the other hand, it wants to kind of conclude in the cosmos. So it has a speculative tenor to it as well, and I'll be reading works that are in relation to photographic works. And I'll talk about those as we approach those. And I wanted those in particular because they also have Cal Arts connections. But I thought I'd begin with the work that gives the book its title, which, the last 10 years it also intersected with the years between 2016 and 2020, and the latter poems have kind of a delirium of the political present that I hope to convey. Or why the assembly disbanded as before. Hosanna in the borderline cinder block warehouse, as much applause as possible to collapse inside an ambulance now that conveys the intravenous bags and bottle holder. 27 stones from here to the Idlewild, to the gun fields. It's a place you find automaton nurses who labor in green-gray subterfuge, in all-over stripes, around punches to the lower jaw, for my part, in the main. So I get it now. I'm the chosen one for reassignment, face so altered as to beguile. This is enemy convenient, a purview suitable to very new cosmetic methods. Question is, the admin, diazepam, and other hypodermics, were they counteractive or now consistent with enough cases as to compel canvassers to anticipate first signs of panic, sleepwalker antecedents, tables in upright position, crushed ice out of open mouth, air-conditioned ward redolent of superstores and tattoo shops? Or was it morphine sulfate and protocols applied to disable the congenital twins? Here's the world news. The junk science prizes wax candy lips intone a flawless, always accented sentence, the kind of talking from another world where my mother was Margot Thomas and there were rival techniques, contributed to the celebrity of my seven-sided disappearance. Was that all my enuresis when I doubled in size, as from her pocketbook, adorable, but already diminishing? So I will read now a poem that interacts with the work of Connie Samaras, who until recently was a photographer and professor at the University of California at Irvine. And the works, I won't say too much about them, except to say that they were photographed with natural light in the evening hours in a lesbian separatist trailer camp somewhere in the desert of Southern California. And as with much of Connie Samaras' work, with which I identify, it's the idea of rendering tribute to social communities and movements, but at the same time looking at it as if it were the future looking back at the past, or maybe it's the other way around. The past was always the future. The transport hours. Held fast to the evolving horizon whose upsurge encircled sooner than it was possible to ascertain before it had hovered there, a touchstone. Act now, for there, even in the brief appraisal, in agreement with the roadway, with the motorhome and trailer park, was conveyed the promise of serenity and freedom, the completion. But there had come by then a tremor in time between always striving to arrive, to assert, to oppose, not this year, maybe next, to contend the proximity of arriving, if in some way no longer here in flight, still from the expanding sphere, departure in the halftones of a secret, wish for some vicinity in a middle landscape, not of this earth. An ether, not especially of our species, desert wakefulness adrift in the leave-taking, double wide the nights, debatable in such final glow advancing, detached from the planetary management, is substitute revenue for all the proper names. So instated was the travel In the continuum, flash expands as though by black light gels dead end of the street for the only transport hour available in the elastic state of imperfect clarity. Center point of the story, its own eviction. This time, certainly. This time, like the last demand to be apart, drawn on such empowerment and skill as to guarantee survival. My body, now a chaos of empowerment and skill as to guarantee survival. My body, now a chaos of excitement, a heat warp over all the improbable minutes in whose duration now to be with the women. I assume the powers of mutation, the aptitude of animals. I duplicate. I meld with the binary numbers. I so cooperate with the machines as to make myself invisible. I sanction the authority of gravel. I indent where the layers ebb. I cross beam even as I contradict the pattern signs of the surface of the land in lesser accidents of stone and sky. I merge the four directions into a solitary segment. I engineer the semblance of a habitat into the subjection of hydration. I review the foregoing. I account for the universal crowd and the long withdrawal. I doubt the imperative, the end effect, there being some confusion as to whether partition was in reference to a present tense or somewhere in the distant shimmer system. Flashback, measured by the alliance of my mothers in triplicate under the vapor light. Flame story of the urban commons, inheritance of the dwelling notes, a passing through of sidelight for Mercury in retrograde, semi-solids for the global south, cathode haze over the settlement, means tantamount to the outcome, such looming as for the pursuit to be ongoing, evanescent, committed nowhere but to the temperature perspective. Ruben Ortiz Torres has been a friend and my former colleague and is a Cal Arts grad. His work, for those of you who are familiar with it, has always been invested in these cultural clashings, particularly between Mexico and the United States. In this series that I respond to, he's really looking at the ways in which pre-colonial architecture has been yet again colonized by the entertainment industry or amusement theme parks. As you'll see, it creates a kind of dissonance and a cognitive dissonance that I respond to in this work. Lost continent. Prismatic light beams and motion to so enhance the monuments encouraging society. Goliath in its seizure of the earth people, former technology of bone. Dawn's incessant yowling, renewed skin, a sort of liquid flesh, that we wish, even as tutors conveyed the alphabet to faraway townships, need, even with our rhetoric of puzzlement, faith overturning the makeshift enclosure, this great asylum in the ancient city of the Indies, to salvage our nation from disgrace, and despairing not, to us was tender the mistress builder, most suitable to bestow the colossal head on ground shuddering, all-day blood, gold great mother, as when we found it, no longer migrant, holy in the highest glory, honor and renown to her, most worthy everywhere throughout all ages and generations. Amen. There were two kinds of breathing in the night. One was jelly-colored and semi-solid, the other stunted in rapture or awestruck in such unbreakable blaze as with increase and coagulates to the artery, to cells that dividing did duplicate, divide and duplicate again, cross-eyed, very close to the triangular nose, upper teeth in baskets and bundles, like a shipment of newspapers, very old admission stubs, a cheap notebook, all things artless, half real anyway, if a casket, if a prankster effigy reflected face in 1,000 interlocking parts of what followed from the center point where I am outside the fiberglass capital, as in the one that beckons for the middle order meaning. Out of isolation and forth to the deputy recitalist of myself in surrogate space, precise eye of a properly positioned witness, like the visitor contained by sound, full ceremony, perverse in aim, as even the strange novelty's current role was, know how natural to relation to the person of the world I was, but a careful construction in the urgent theme as a single death. In the modest epic, most immediate of our demise, I mean recall, translucent and disposable, the remaining corpses, world that was smaller than. Were we so immune to escalation, had there been more to fabricate in the lost continent and to relay? I acknowledged the cranium from the old populace and paid my tribute to the new passing reference in degrees of routine, or memory as was prone to fit on gossamer sail. Quote, the laboring populace had lost its faith, the non-development. You work if you intend to eat, already by mice and truck with the factory vanguard. A millennium or two of meteoric growth in onshore commerce, while the class struggle, while the opposing party adored the technocrats who made vulnerable, ignored best practice, and auspicious to the earth folk who bestowed us no distinction as with the likes of blue-collar wage labor output or production lines given to the friendly fire hydrants and phone booths from the hard workers at the local megastore, for the lot of us wretched who learned to accept your differences and embrace our flaws. Boomtown hub, big money, high style, and ostentatious wealth, long replaced even in the labor union. I used to think model worker was a title for ordinary bodies that toiled hard, rules and regulations notwithstanding, the racketeer reported. But now, migrant workers like me also merit the distinction, proving once again the elected culture populace in the atomic age meets the temple of inscription slogan to oppose re-election, of the general strict of revolutionary nuance, temple of the sun telling temple of account to savage temple of the foliated cross sharp on the oncoming axe blade of aqueduct, wind glint, the vertical distance relative to the reference point of an edifice projected onto a plane vertical to temple of the lion, sleep bundled mouth openness though to bellowing siren, structure 12, phase 6 devoid of shading, ritual appended to official documents, chiseled to the rhythm other than my own. Because they feared the perils and aftermath in more ways than they loved the light that would lead them sometimes asunder. Dynasty novelty of all modern convenience to resemble a product sold inside as the alphabet attraction of its architects, a theory. They didn't doubt that there was God killed by coagulation, a land could so venerate as to muse. God who, not enough to claim by open gashing of the solar plexus, Queen's Bishop to Huitzilopochtli, I was awakened at 1 a.m. A terrible moment. I thought maybe thieves, rain otherwise dripping all over this household, and still no arrival. I'm desperate. Rainwater refusing to obey if the drain pipe moans or ended if only this and nothing else. It was time for the replacement mother, a cactus flesh that wasn't flesh from the flaming mortar of antiquity, to declare the northern desert exile for all measure of paterfamilias, hyperkinetic emblem in saturated color after the mashup act between neighboring nations, arsenal of food stuff and lower transit by request, sensation new to denizens demanding entertainment of the ignited variety, cartoon cigar that detonates to singe my face into an orifice too of blinking light, or pyramid permitting matters at first to so decline. There's the Baroque image. The Baroque has been very important to me, and partly it's in the work of Rouben as well, but the idea that the Baroque has been important to contemporary writers in Latin America and to contemporary artists, insofar as it refers not to a particular historical period, but to both a curiosity, the Baroque curiosity that is both festive and filled with all kinds of anxiety. And this is a place that I find very productive.
Vanishing. Amulets that share kinship in the history of light and language when I unite the number 9 to 27. The word tangerine to lemongrass, meadow spur to thistle, glimmer to despair, dry that fades, splinter of duration evanescing, double life conjured by vocables from a zone of repetition, its glow at the origin, vision contingent at the level of the letter, all things abrupt now, intermittent. Claimed singular, never less than overstatement when I slip into the view out of joint with experience. When attributes of bliss and cataclysm reside not in portentous totality, but in the ordinary detail. Attention requisite for me to tell the narratives of sight and sound and transformation. Discrete words of partial view. But even as I surface, subject to predicate at best, a proposition, belated reason, I am the cause of my thoughts. Why, in the domains of the ether, in the pharmacology of everyday matter, in the flattened contours, my singular life, a social statistic, is the charm not of narrative consequence, bestowed on me as script of action, as to navigate the intangible space of so much undigested information, rib in the web of meaning when I cast and draw. But owing to the gash, where to see is to know, am I careful in my unwanted thought and desires for such a gesture as to embolden, persuade, limberness, untangle the strict partition without hazard to the shell protective of all persons provisional in settings that reflect. I cover ground. I quicken. I substitute the vanishing with constituent parts, regenerate. Deprived of a halo, released from its fixity, am I not without radiance of my convenient forgetting, and every day because it so beckons in the recurring custody of a world around whose mindfulness we congregate and over which we are inclined to argue? This work I consider kind of modular work, and it was written as I was spending time in Sao Paulo, and the time I had there was quite brief, so I had to find a very modular form and a condensed form of trying to accommodate, on the one hand, the strange or weird universalism of the social media, but in such a way that could also speak to the kind of narrative that works only when two images that are unrelated form a kind of flashpoint between the two. And so I also did, posterior to the writing of this piece entitled Indivisible Continuum, a photo essay that I'll be showing you that is in relation, composed afterwards, but trying to form a kind of perhaps speculative noir that looks to the inner space and then to the cosmos, whose epigraph is from none other than Buckminster Fuller. Indivisible Continuum. I seem to be a verb, an evolutionary process, an integral function of the universe. Buckminster Fuller. In story, selfhood palpable as by time lapse, onlooker perception modified, wakefulness altered, view to the familiar landscape redirected. Allegiance to outcome in excess of the evidence intoxicates because it comes to define the twin life, already nascent, but still without form. In story, knowledge obtained from the unremarked, in the vicissitudes, also of method and media, grounds for symbolic action in public. So the lucky break led us to be reckless, overhang favored by the council, fault line by dint of our mortgage, the oil field unincorporated. Faced with the ineluctable severity of law and its link to dissolution, speech, and concealment, breath kingdom divided when opportunity fails on the third. Same old ability to speak as ever, for whom acquisitive I exist alone in the privilege of my household. There's an image on the television. Return to the scene, posterior effect to cause what places to the original, with an obedience whose compulsions appear identical to choice. From the viewpoint of method, even this pantomime futility appearing as choice is the incremental mind to write the shapeless succession. Landscape foreboding when circumstance bewilders the faculties, figure incidental to, inconsistent with, what animates and halts in mid-motion. Disdain and envy of the idle, so submitting to my satisfaction as to favor me the mortar and method to raise a causeway out of estrangement. Hard kernel in nightmares to convince it occurred at the quarry. Our intent to find failing, even now shallow graves still map the desert. Denied degrees of realism, unearth the spillway, enough edible labor and dose for fueling the gel objective to absorb the body shock. Homecoming for that underground encouragement whose purpose it was to threaten with countercalculus of maul, blaze, and smothering ash. If in the brickyard, if in the chromium disclosure copyright, if in my signature all demise draw closer, triangle, bylaw, some protein. Even with slurred tongue and cracked teeth, I discern a benign country beyond for me to confer there my night custody and coat of arms. Same unfounded sensation inside, same tenacious advances from my departure point, ether and its sinuous release to anesthetize the galaxy. Bifurcate address, scales cascading relative to valve, let loose by instinct to counter for being just one of assembly's constituent parts. A calendar that tenders all authority to this. Cloud forests encouraging descent into the grasslands and smoke throughout the length of time. Believe me only on Tuesday, detachable, when I submit the descriptions were an upsurge, rodent, upbraiding to suit the lowland democracy. The sunlight concern was fraught with amalgams of attributes, dislocated birthplace, weightless silver for all the accounting, exuberance. Redolent of past perfect convulsions, barbed, curvature of energy, foliate, exfoliate, grow, drape, or flash festoon, sovereignty is undertow. Three times kindle foundry torrents of liquid alloys that cool by cascade into the modest pills you ingest when the life story obsolesces. Why, if it most resembles agitation, if all the same withheld, if a timbre insinuates its deviant hiss for throngs of unsuspecting listeners, skills for amazement in this vicinity adjoined the condition of those who chain, splinter, switchback, would alter the object of finality. Consistency to defy the pitfalls of persistence, such outpouring, blaze, metal, foam, as to compromise my behavior in the tablet era. A new form for spatial experience afforded by throngs ready for the fusillade, poised to astonish eventual phosphorus defiant of touch. Inquiry restraint, 9 places of dust settled, abandoned, each quiet removal on the edge of inching cliff, its crystal nerve to splinter. So safeguarding the ground to inhabit, encircled rotation of grain, for example, after cotton, as for reverence, as when it reiterates, always. According to ratio and legerdemain, there comes a seizure that, whether by confinement or consensus, unleashes so many species in parcel and drove. In the regime of curiosity, axioms incremental to, dependent on, coming after the set, always of arranging it, all to so exist as a category. Taken to emerge out of the slough and cinder, enough to oxygenate minor life forms swelling that angles to gestures of hazy aspiration. In my homecoming was the future moving to register an inventory of experience I deform even as I deride what confines me to separate circumstance. Was it already lost? First temper known to appear only in escape or distraction. What if long enough buried even as a half-hearted kindness? In a sense, it's a kind of endless chain. I think I will read a poem precisely that was written after the elections of 2016. And then I'll read one more poem. American household. Here I'm untethered, or else this American household is. A shame for guest and resident alike, torn asunder. Immovable, unmoving, horizon line before it closes on the embankment, which is too a swine thunder. Whether cash and cake were meant for us, the undeserving, is a frenzy of thought, an amusement from the spoils, a corporation able to outweigh the willing, unnerving, all restraint from the madness or immodesty that coils each milligram back into the sky blue oxy addiction McKesson, Cardinal Health, and AmerisourceBergen manufactured for the painless end-to-end encryption's other plum, for which we are to wait again our turn in line, and still the others keep cutting ahead of us here, the complected and other-tongued asylum-seeking assembly of the glad in ordinary deliverance from fear. First fuel in the plot that turns us into tyrants unspeaking, yet another dream to make them do what in wakeful hour is lawless for us to crave and still deprived of power. And many of these poems attempt to find a kind of fourth person singular in which not one voice, but a forms of life in person, right? Giving them a kind of bodily existence, even though I may find them particularly repugnant. And I'll end with this poem. Many of the poems you have hopefully assessed have a genesis in sort of the dreamscape, and this one begins there and ends in, I think, the anxiety dream par excellence is running in place, but there's another one that is to do with instruction. Kill time objective. For the sake of my acoustic self, I lead out of danger an anonymous pack from the building entrapment secured by militia. First prompted was the malformation, other species techniques I thought would never keep me from the village of relation. Even now, a third person plural to ask in a chorus concerned with all the unsanctioned disclosures we expressed in such adversaries our interests. We divine from them a quantum of intelligence. Soon adjusted, of my amplitude I escape, and striving escalate the only barrier dividing inside from the thick steel at first translucent, gleaming now, but with the weathered cackle glaze, suspending the ability to recognize the likeness. And I panic, overjoyed or appalled, anyway the bass line exhausting the tonal pitch, insofar as they see not my face, no matter how close they look, first and foremost classified, chiefly management, mostly disapproving. Soon the phonic constellation after hours of the data harvest, room tone, proximity to source, boredom of the solar system, estuary trespass, soon as maps were to the mirror sequence by leaning on present, complicity was the frenzy of flesh, muddle of tongues, a ransom note, but for the sake of fighting for breath already the instrument for transposition in a parasitic image finding proper to this place. I am the encryption. I am the statistic no longer bristling with heroics of metaphor. I am equipped with artillery that enables me now to bullet an opening for everyone's deliverance. But for the scene change, lodgings very disinfected, new cause for residing in that I trace it back to the assignment room and retrieve, because arson, what I misplaced, and anew under observation now. Two performers licentious, but so approving of the spinal cord perspective as to marvel at the sheer outrage and wonder of the surgical incision. But for the tangled purpose of the anatomy we take to name eviscerate. But for the conference hour this week with my parishioners in exchange for the motion in multiple layers, overcoat, many trousers, uniform. In the process also of my ballooning self into unprecedented scales of subjection. As soon as I recite the lines that tell the world of the authority to petrify, to touch, and be tutored or otherwise curb, but never entirely embraced, no matter the many hours we waited on Ledgewood to trust the day. But for the amassing body attributes of my contempt and retribution, but for the ever more audacious interference at the level of my molecular resemblance, but for the album, now children, Please open to lesson 32. Thank you. Kenny and Rose had asked, there's time for questions if there are any questions. I'm happy. Yes.
Can you talk more about the Baroque in Latin America and it being a place of anxiety and why and how?
Yes. So the reason the Baroque has captured imaginations posterior to the very brutal, the brutalities of what was the new so-called New World experience, which was basically the conquest and colonization of these peoples. Out of that, in one version of this, of the Baroque, would be that it brought into conflict and to antagonisms very different aspects of both cultural meaning, bodies, and even bodies, and that created a sense of, on one hand, horror, but on the other hand, also wonder that they're out of this disastrous catastrophe that was the conquest of the Americas, something survived, and that something, some versions, is that syncretic culture that came out of the colonial period. And because of its brutalities, there's something about the colonial Baroque that allows for paradox, violence, and sexuality, for example. And this captured the imagination of poets, particularly in the 1970s, who were rereading a poet who I've translated from Cuba in the mid-1950s, the great mid-century modernist Jose Lezama Lima. And what Lezama Lima did was precisely go back to the Spanish Golden Age, poets like Lope de Vega, Garcilaso de la Vega, and turned the Baroque curiosity on its head so that it was writing back from the colonies to the empire, and using also a surrealist vocabulary that I would say that is defined by the sensorium, the exuberance of the sensorium. The poets in the 1970s, you can find an anthology called Medusario that was edited by Jacobo Stefani, who used to teach at the University of California, Irvine, Roberto Chavarren, Argentine poet, and they trace a kind of excess, a maximalist aesthetic that is indebted to the Baroque, which of course was also trying to undo some of the tendencies in 1960s poetry that took social realism as the base point, right? And so much of this work, Corral Gracia in Mexico, Roberto Chavarren in Argentina, Jose Coser, a Cuban poet in New York, to name just a few, expanded the possibility of what a poem can do insofar as it is also a surface object. And as an object, these poets were interested in maximizing the potential and both the timbre and the color schemes, and therefore the political valence of the poem. I mean, some would consider someone like Raul Zurita also, whose incantatory poetry speaks of the violence of the Americas with a kind of an excessive or maximalist perspective. They're largely unread in the United States, many of them are beginning to be translated, but I also have a feeling that, and I would say that two tendencies are very dear to my heart, and yet they are opposed in many ways, which is the Baroque or the Neo-Baroque from Latin America and the objectivist poetry of the United States, which is absolutely the opposite, right? In its minimalist and its kind of disappearance of a form of life we want to call the self, right? And yet, bringing them together in my mind is a productive or generative antagonism. You can ask something.
Yeah, first, thank you very much for your work. You used a phrase that was so interesting to me, the fourth person singular. Can you say a little bit more about that?
This is a Deleuzian phrase that he uses it precisely to kind of think of ways in which one can get out of the habituated practices about the self, either the first person singular I, the first person plural we, and also the second person or the third person they. That somehow there can be a multi-perspective mode that is not outside of lived experience, which is why Brian Mustami calls it a form of life in person. That it is definitely a bodily incorporated experience that is not necessarily aligned to anyone, for anyone, an exclusive experience that we would call selfhood or personhood. So that's why the fourth person singular is kind of interesting way to think about what, you know, the poem can do many, many things, and it need only be aligned to reporting of experience as we understand it in expository writing, I guess.
Thank you.
Sure.
I was wondering if you wanted to expand a little bit more on a Baroque aesthetic with relation to the entanglement that you seem to be having with sort of like official rhetoric, what you call in one line the ineluctable severity of the law.
I like that. In part because I think if you're responding to my delight in certain rhetorical possibilities, yes. So the Baroque or the Neo-Baroque may, in some cases, turn to rhetorics of the past as a template, right? But on the one hand, it takes us to a place that would seem to be anachronistic. And so that anachronistic place, in my view of it, in my understanding of why the Neo-Baroque can be an interesting modality, is that it opens up various temporalities that are neither the past nor the present. Perhaps something that might be described as a petrified unrest that's Benjamin's term, right? For allegory. It kind of congeals things that are actually in motion and that belong to two different historical periods and processes, but is able, like the Baroque paradox, to keep opposites hovering in place, even though they're contradictory. They can exist, if even only in an evanescent moment. And so I'm drawn to that. I mean, I think that the law, as we understand it, is not just the legal code, but also the laws that we inherit in terms of poetic fiction, right? Thanks.
Thanks so much for visiting us and for reading such wonderful work. Your poetry so strongly engages with architecture, and I'm curious if you could talk about the architecture of your poetry. You alluded to endless modularity, which I find really fascinating. I'm wondering if you can talk about modular poetry and issues of the sequential and the serial and so on.
No, thank you. I mean, I think I would say that I approach the built environment or architecture primarily through photography, so that it's, although I would say that, and I do think of the unit we identify as a poem as a livable space in which one can move around. And so I'm drawn to the uncanny because it's both a home and it's an addiction at the same time. And I think that's not exactly answering the modular aspect of it, but at least I try to find, that is to say, the poem tries to find forms that enact that anxiety of being both welcome and unwelcome, of being belonging and unbelonging, or never being able to belong. And then in terms of the modular, this is relatively new, but as I was writing these, in addition to thinking about the new forms that circulate in social media, which have a very particular word count and so forth, or character count, it seemed what I was drawn to was the kind of double helix of that possibility that one could, theoretically one could read them in a particular order because they're not and the page is very different, but in some virtual environments, it's possible to read out of any particular temporality, right? And that is something that I found to be interesting. And space also in regard to the ways in which we have concrete space, but the ways in which we navigate even in virtual atmospheres that are spatial, even to the degree that they want to make invisible their spatiality, right? That there's on one hand a desire to make it transparent or naturalize or flatten in some kind of way. But I would say again, I think the architectural desire that drives some of the work is in relation to world building. And I think that what I'm drawn to in not just in poetry, but in other kinds of writing, even so-called scholarly writing, are those places where we can leave this one behind and build other worlds, possibly future worlds, that comment on the present. And architecture seems to be a place where the body, this might be a surrealist inheritance. And I think one of the great contributions of surrealism was that it allowed us to see that the degree to which one's body is amplified, one's surroundings become less defined. And the degree to which one's surroundings are hyper-defined, one's body decreases in definition. And that equation is something of interest to me. And I think the poem can do that as well.
Rebecca here. Roberto Tejada, thank you so much.
Yeah. I love that. Avatar
Yeah, I